There are so many books that one could read, and you could spend the rest of your life interpreting them. I have always enjoyed the Bible. It's so rich. And I wanted to share something with you about interpreting a lesson. And I didn't want to do Shakespeare, because that's my fallback. So I thought I would do something from Genesis. So if you might have flashbacks of Sunday school or Hebrew school, but we're going to do a little Bible study this morning. Reading from the book of Genesis, selections from chapters 30 and 31. When Rachel had borne Joseph Jacob said to Laban, "Send me away that I may go to my own home and country. Give me my wives and my children, for whom I have served you, and let me go." But Laban said to him, "I have learned by divination that the Lord has blessed me because of you. Name your wages, and I will give it." And when Laban was far away with his flocks, an angel of God said to Jacob in a dream, "Jacob." And I said, "Here I am. I am the God of Bethel, where you anointed a pillar and made a vow to me. Now arise, go forth from this land and return to the land of your birth." While Laban was gone, Rachel stole her father's household gods. Jacob did not know that Rachel had stolen them. So Jacob arose and set his sons and his wives on camels, and he drove away all the cattle and livestock in his possession, and Jacob fled with all that he had. Laban learned that Jacob had fled, and Laban took his kinsmen and pursued him. But God came to Laban the Aramean in a dream by night and said to him, "Take heed that you say not a word to Jacob, either good or bad." And Laban overtook Jacob and said to him, "Why did you flee so secretly and cheat me? Now you have done foolishly. It is in my power to do you harm, but the God of your father spoke to me at night in a dream, saying, 'Take heed that you do not speak to Jacob, either good or bad.' And now you have gone away because you have longed greatly for your father's house. But why did you steal my household gods?" Then Laban searched all the tents and did not find them, for Rachel had hidden the household gods and put them in her saddlebags upon the camel where she was seated. And Rachel said to her father Laban, "Let not my lord be angry that I cannot rise before you, for the way of women is upon me." So Laban searched but did not find the household gods. I guess it'd be appropriate, right? Thus ends our reading. No, we're not doing that. All right. In the summer of 1967, I was 13 years old, and my grandfather, Walter Shear, was about my age now. 71. The farmhouse where he and my grandmother lived was supplied by water through a wooden pipe from a spring house that sat on the top of a nearby hill. After several decades, the pipe submerged beneath the soil, and finally it collapsed, leaving the house without water. While my grandfather searched for the busted pipe, I was tasked with fetching water from the old schoolhouse pump across the country road about 200 yards away, down the hill and across. And because my grandfather was so handy, he fashioned me a yoke. I mean, really, how many people have yokes? Here you go, Alan. Have a yoke. So he fashioned me a yoke so that I could carry 2 full buckets of water, multiple trips every morning, across the street to fill every pot in the house, as well as the old clawfoot tub. Walter finally gave up on finding the spring house pipe and decided to drill a well. But where do you tell the well drillers to dig? There. Not going to be up on the hillside where the spring house was. So he cut a slender green branch and trimmed it into a handy Y shape with slim handles. He twisted it a little bit so that the tip of this Y-shaped stick bent up. Get it? He walked slowly across the mowed pasture in front of the farmhouse until the stick tip on its own power bent downwards, and he announced, "Right here is where we'll dig the well." I wasn't really used to this whole idea of divining for water. So he said, "Come on, Alan, try it out." So I did. I held it in my hand. I twisted my hands, my wrists like this. It went up, and then I walked around. And as much as I didn't want it to go down, it did. He says, "Okay, you did it. We will dig our well there." And so the well drillers came by, and he said, "There." And about 30 feet later, they encountered a 20-foot deep river flowing underneath the property. And that is still the well that we use to this day. How that divining rod worked was a mystery then and remains so today. But what I didn't think about then or now was that some divinity was showing me through the divining rod where water was to be found. Religions are cultural practices that change over time. This homily is an origin story of religions from which 21st century Unitarian Universalists arose. And from our study, I hope to show just how much we have changed, even as we are still evolving and being transformed. Every religion on earth once or still has some kind of divinatory practice that seeks answers to important questions, like, where can I find water? Or more importantly, judicial innocence or guilt, truth or falsehood, advice in decision-making. These practices come in different forms, but the common belief is that this world is so saturated with the divine that the sacred infuses the world in such an intimate way that you can call upon the divinity and ask it questions, and it will tell you the answer that you seek, hopefully. Some ancient divinatory practices include reading the entrails of sacrificed animals. Yuck. Interpreting the flight of birds. I like this one. The ancient Chinese read a pattern of cracks in a cleaned out tortoise shell when the shell was heated, and they would read it. So, palmistry, tarot cards, all of these are forms of divination. Only specially trained persons, priests, priestesses, with the proper tools, adhering to the rigorous requirements of the practice, can and are allowed to divine the will of God. One kind of divinatory practice was casting lots. What does God have in store? Throw those. We know from the Bible that the ancient Hebrews had a practice of casting dice. The Urim and the Thummim. Urim means curse, Thummim means faultless, and these names referred to the deity's judgment of the accused person. In other words, Urim and Thummim were used to answer the question of innocence or guilt, yes or no. In the books of Samuel, whenever Saul or David wished to question God, they asked a priest, the only authorized person, to cast the Urim and Thummim. Ask the priest, throw the dice, figure out what God wants you to do. If it were only that easy now. The Bible has references to divinatory practices other than the Urim and the Thummim. For example, dream interpretation. There are a couple of dreams going on in that Bible verse from Genesis. But I want to speak to you a little bit about these Genesis verses about the stolen statues. That's the kind of stuff when I'm reading the Bible, it's like, what does that mean? What are the statues? Rachel steals them, hides them in her baggage, and then tells the guys, sorry, you can't search it, I'm on my period. You know, it's like, oh, okay, don't get near her, she's unclean. I mean, that kind of stuff just excites my imagination. So I decided for this morning I'd do a little research and share some of the fun with you. Laban calls them gods, but they're not the major gods of the ancient Near Eastern pantheon. They're not Marduk or Inanna. They're household gods. They're called teraphim in Hebrew, and they are statues, and they vary in size. Some of them can be 6 to 9 inches, others can be larger, like this story in 1 Samuel chapter 19, we read about Micah, one of the young teenage daughters of King Saul, and David's first wife. Young David's statues were so large that Micah put one of them in his empty bed and made a little goat skin wig to look like David's sleeping head and covered the whole thing with a blanket to thwart the assassins that Saul had sent to kill David. And what they found the statue under the covers. That's how big it was, right? So it could have been 5 feet. Laban, in our story, was a nomadic shepherd who could carry his teraphim statues. Archaeological excavations have uncovered clay or stone teraphim 6 to 9 inches tall. Genesis chapter 1 tells how Laban was out in the field shearing his flocks of sheep. Rachel snuck into her father's tent and took off with the teraphim. Theory 1. Teraphim statues were thought to have divinatory powers. Rachel stole them so that her father would not be able to divine their whereabouts as they secretly fled him with all their accumulated wealth in herds, wives, and children. This was all Jacob's stuff. Other interpreters claim that Rachel believed that teraphim possessed a kind of magical power to bless barren women with children, a serious issue for both Leah and Rachel. Not only did the teraphim have divinatory and magical properties, they were also symbols of the authority of the owner. Laban's judicial authority and political power is represented in the teraphim that he possessed. Probably when he was holding forth in court, he would have his teraphim there with him on his seat. He was the chieftain because of his wealth in livestock, the number of persons in his extended family, and the number of others under obligation who were employed by him or under his protection. Laban was a kind of godfather. Some commentators think Rachel took Laban's teraphim for economic rather than political or divinatory reasons, because ownership of the teraphim meant that she and Jacob could inherit some of the stuff that belonged to Laban. Possessing the statues was like having a final will and testament, stating that whoever possesses them inherits everything. It could be that Rachel believed that possessing Laban's teraphim gave her some protection from his wrath, or that she might obtain a pardon from her father if they were pursued and caught and the teraphim returned. But she doesn't give them up. In fact, she discourages anyone searching her person or baggage because of the threat of uncleanliness. By mentioning that she was menstruating, ensured that all the men would keep their distance so as to maintain their ritual purity. Another theory, Rachel's theft of the teraphim could have been an attempt to establish tribal leadership for Jacob. Rightfully, the teraphim denoted her elder brother's inheritance rights. They were for Laban like a badge of office, a real estate deed, a last will and testament, a royal scepter, and so much more. Knowing this, we can better understand Laban's extreme displeasure with their loss. Despite Laban declaring that really wanted to say goodbye to his grandchildren and was kind of suspect of why they had to sneak out and take all their stuff, really what he wanted was his statues. The whole thing revolves around Laban chasing them so that he can recover his statues. If Laban had found them, he would have reclaimed them and left Rachel and Jacob. But he doesn't find them. And knowing they had been stolen, obviously, and can't find them, it made for bad blood between Laban and Jacob. The estimated time period when Laban and Jacob, Leah and Rachel lived was about the year 1880 BCE, nearly 4,000 years ago. And those gods of those people were associated with particular places. They were very local. The god of Bethel, in the Bible verse that I read, reminds Jacob in a dream, another divinatory practice, of the vow he made. All right, so you make a promise at a place, and he pours oil on top of a standing stone on a mountaintop. It's the kind of thing we do all the time, right? Jacob does all of this about returning to his homeland because the God of Bethel that Jacob poured the oil on a standing stone, on a mountaintop, back in Judea, told him to go. Remember me? God of Bethel? So you get the idea. Who these people were and how they identified themselves changed over the centuries. Laban and his clan were denoted in the Bible in Genesis as wandering Arameans. Jacob was included in this identification, and eventually he was given a new name, Israel, when he settled in the land of Canaan. His descendants were called Israelites. And when they were released from slavery in Egypt about 6 centuries later, that's what they were known as, Israelites. These people remained Israelites for another 600 years until the Babylonian captivity in the 6th century BCE. When they began to trickle back into Judea after 2 generations in captivity, they were much changed, and they had a new name. They were the people from Judea. The religion they practiced was Judaism. The people were now known as Jews. The book of Genesis was probably compiled, collated, and edited from many different sources by the captives who were in Babylon. And so the book of Genesis begins to be assembled around the year 598 BCE. The exiled Jews are living there. They're amidst the polytheism of the capital city of the Neo-Babylonian Empire, Babylon. And they were determined to keep their identity and to keep their faith distinct from the polytheism in which they were immersed. The Judean exiles in Babylon were determined not to let their identity fade. And so how do you do that? You start collecting the stories of your people, and you reframe the stories in such a way so that anyone that would read them would understand that we are here and we are different from the Babylonians. Don't be attracted by their polytheism. In Genesis chapter 35, verses 2 through 4, we read God saying to Jacob, "Get rid of the foreign gods that you have with you." This is after they had escaped Laban and are back in Judea. God knew they probably took the teraphim. You get the writer's idea of this. This admonition of God to Jacob is really addressed to the captives in Babylon to become Judean monotheists. Get rid of the foreign gods. Just foreign gods? Marduk, Inanna? Well, what about the little household gods? What about my own teraphim? Do we have to get rid of them too? No, not really. The transition from polytheism to Judean monotheism and strict monotheism took centuries. Then you can see how important it was to emphasize their identity as monotheists when these captives, they were only numbering 7,000 people in Babylon, the largest city of the ancient world. 200,000 people live in Babylon, and the whole thing has a state-run religion. There are priests, there are temples. It is all there, that polytheism, all those major gods. And here are 7,000 Israelites captive amidst all of this. And so the people that were putting together the Bible, the priests that were there and assembling the stories, they really had an agenda. When Cyrus, the Persian king, conquered Babylon in 539 BCE, he allowed each captive population to return to their homelands. And so was it after 80 years, and estimated now from 7,000, 40,000 Jews found their way back to Judea over the next several decades. They all didn't go at once. They trickled back over 20, 25 years. When Jerusalem scholars in Babylon started compiling what would later become the Hebrew Bible, Christians call it the Old Testament, they accepted the fact that during the time of Laban and Jacob, Rachel and Leah, the practice of polytheism was universal. It was always there, it was outside, got your household gods. There's all sorts of divinities. They understood that everyone, even their founding fathers of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, were sort of polytheistic with their teraphim and holy dice and divining the messages of God in dreams. They had to work it into the scriptures because their minority status as monotheists, they were determined to preserve it as Judean monotheists. Becoming exclusive monotheists was a gradual process taking several more centuries. We know polytheism persisted in Judaism because possessing teraphim was a practice that faded very slowly, centuries slowly. About 500, 600 years later, the Jewish general and historian Josephus talks about first century Jews, this is probably a generation after Jesus, that these Jews still had their household gods, and they took them with them whenever they emigrated. The exiles in Babylon were determined to distinguish themselves as a covenant people dedicated to one God and to resist the influence of the state-sponsored polytheism that they were immersed in. So throughout the Old Testament, editors include stories of the struggle against the attractions of polytheism. The poet theologian who compiled the stories that would become the book of Genesis lived over 1,000 years after the time of Laban the Aramean, when the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob was just one God among many, as it says in the Ten Commandments, "Thou shalt have no other gods before me." It doesn't say there's only one. Their understanding of the divine pantheon is that there's one head God, he's kind of like the CEO, and then there's all these other gods. So Zeus and, right? So you've got this pantheon. But they were trying to elevate their God, Yahweh, Adonai, into the CEO. And then eventually we're going to let all the other ones fade. And slowly over the centuries, they did fade. The emphasis on one transcendent deity is one of the reasons behind both Judaism's and Islam's disbelief in the incarnation. They were so monotheistic that they couldn't get used to the Christian idea that God became flesh. No. God is always God. God is transcendent. He is supernatural. He's above all this stuff. He doesn't become a fleshy human being. Jews and Muslims reject that idea. And we have more in common with them in that regard than we might have with Christians who believe in an incarnation. We are Unitarians. If you believe in a God, there's only one of them. But we've got room for pagans. We've got room for multiple ideas of the sacred in our very wide, accepting idea of what it means to be a Unitarian Universalist. But becoming monotheist had a price. The intimacy of the divine for the wandering Arameans, where the gods lived in the natural world, who could be consulted by divination, who had a place. Yeah, God lives over there on that mountain. When you become a monotheist with a transcendent deity, he or she or they leave. They are transcendent. They're not on the hill. They can't be seen in the divination practices. They're not going to tell you anything by casting dice or in the interpretation of dreams. They are gone from this world. Rachel stole the teraphim, and Jacob possessed them, but a little while later, as they say, in chapter 35, God says to Jacob, "Get rid of the foreign gods that you have with you. No more teraphim." I might keep maybe just a little one. The time had come to dump the teraphim. God's admonishing Jacob is really addressed to the captives in Babylon, surrounded by the powerfully successful official gods of the Babylonian pantheon of the empire. And these verses were addressed to everyone returning to Judea, some of whom perhaps were taking their teraphim and maybe some other parts of polytheism back to Judea with them. The admonition is clear. When returning to the land promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, don't hide them in your luggage. Leave the teraphim behind. Thank you.